Good afternoon, this is Jerry Alt again. This is part two of my series on the principles of photography. If you watched part one, I went over the topics that we're going to cover in this entire series. I'm breaking it down into 6 or 7 bite-sized pieces. So the whole concept behind this is if you're someone who enjoys photography, not necessarily a budding professional, then I want to give you some tips, hints, a little bit of education about your camera so that you can go from taking snapshots to actually creating art. So in the first one, we talked about understanding the photographic process, a little bit about how the camera actually works. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of light. And then you can see looking ahead, our next one's going to be the elements of what makes up a quote-unquote good photo, then talking about creating composition and telling a story. And then the last couple of episodes will be talking about the equipment you use, why it isn't necessarily important that you have the best camera, and finally some techniques. So separating the stuff you use from how you use it, we'll talk about some techniques that will help you improve your photography, even if you think you're doing pretty good now. So the importance of light. We're going to cover this pretty generally, no math involved, but there's what photographers call the exposure triangle. Your camera, when you use it on the easy mode or the automatic mode, the green button mode, whatever that may be, the camera tries to use its brain to balance 3 different aspects of the photographic process that give you a good exposure. At the top is ISO. Think about ISO as the sensitivity of your camera. Back in the film days, you had what was called ASA, not ISO, and the ASA film speed. So if you were doing photographs back then, you might have had 100 film, 200 film, and then later on even 400 or 800. And what that referred to was the light sensitivity of that film. Today, with digital sensors, it refers to the sensitivity of the receptors in your digital camera to read the amount of light that's coming through. So think of that as the environmental issue. You know, how much light is there generally? The other 2 things that are more dependent on your camera and your lens, if you look at the bottom left, is aperture. Aperture refers to the amount of light that is being let in through the lens to your camera. So it could be very bright outside, but if your camera is what we call stopped down, so that you have a very small aperture or ring in the lens, and I'll explain that in a moment, then only a little bit of that light will get into the sensor. And then the third is the shutter speed. That is how fast the camera reacts and snaps the photo, if you will. So let's get into that. When we talk about aperture, you can see in this diagram that the various apertures, and they were referred to as f-stops, the smaller the number, the more light is let in. So a typical lens that you might get with a consumer camera might be an f4 or an f5.6, meaning that's the most sensitive that lens will allow the light in. And for general point and shoot cameras, that's typically what you get. At the higher end, you can get a lens that stops down to f22 or even f32, which is a very, very small amount of light. So you can see in the same size lens represented on the right, depending on what you set that aperture, you're either going to get a lot of light streaming in for the period of time, the duration of your shutter speed, or you're going to get very little. So think of the aperture like the iris in your eye. If you have ever played with a cat, or if you own a cat, you know that when you expose their eyes to a lot of light, then they get very, very small. And when it's darker, then that iris opens up. That's why the human being can see in relative darkness, because our irises and our eyes adjust, they squint, if you will, when we have bright sun, and then they open up more when we get murky, gloomy, or or post-sunset conditions. There is an aspect of this, and when we talk about what makes up a good photo, I'll talk about that a little bit more. But having the lens wide open and letting so much light in will give you a different perceived depth of field. That is, how much of your image appears to be in focus. At the very small end, at an f/22 or an f/32, what happens is that pretty much everything from the front of the picture to the back will be in focus. Wide open, the things you aim at and the camera focuses on will be in relative sharpness, and the other things in the background will be blurry or have what we call bokeh. So we'll get back to that in a future episode. But just to give you an idea, the shutter speed regulates the amount of light that's entering into the sensor. So think about it in this sense. The shutter typically is going pretty fast. You know, when you click your camera or when you push the button on the side of your phone to take a picture, you just hear it go click, and it seems really quick. But relatively speaking, if there's a lot of light, clicking at the same speed will let more light in if it's bright out than it will if it's cloudy or if it's dark. That doesn't have as much impact if you're using a flash, because the flash typically has a duration that is significantly faster than the physical shutter on your camera. So it's going to be a blink, literally a blink of an eye. When you're shooting outdoors, and many of you, especially if you're beginning photographers, may have a camera that's got the little pop-up flash, but you're taking pictures in your house, in your yard, around with your family. And if you're using that green button again and you haven't advanced to the other functions, then what happens is the camera is evaluating that light that appears to be in the scene and is adjusting the shutter speed for you to avoid getting too much light, which would overexpose your picture, or having the shutter be too fast and it would become underexposed and you'd lose the detail. The other thing that I talked about, the ISO, what that does is, think about it as kind of the level of water in the pool, if you will. It's just the general ambient environment around you. The human eye can see a lot more detail in lower light than your camera. So what current digital cameras do is it adjusts this ISO. And again, if you're shooting an automatic, it will try to make a balance between shutter speed, aperture, and the ISO to create a sweet spot where you can get a halfway decent photo. But you may think that it looks good. It may look good through the lens and it's still a little dark. You can usually impact that by going out of the green mode, not letting the computer take all the decision making away from you, and adjust the ISO up to a reasonable amount. So you're increasing, if you will, the amount of available light that's coming in. The problem with going too high on that is ISO is the function of the camera that's artificially making it more sensitive, so it can introduce noise into the photos. And we'll talk about that when we talk about good and bad photos in a future episode. Okay, all three of the parameters we discussed influence the photograph, but what it all boils down to is finding a way to get the proper amount of light to come into the camera and create a proper exposure. And that is not only a function of the right amount, but the right kind of light. So I've got a quote here from George Eastman of the Eastman Kodak Company. Light makes photography. Embrace the light, admire it, but above all, know it. Because if you know it for all you're worth, you will know the key to photography. The transition I made from being a hobbyist to a professional was really hinged on understanding light, understanding the qualities and direction of light so that I could make better, more interesting photos. So, talked about how the light is controlled in your camera. Now let's talk about, just generally speaking, the characteristics of light. There's four main characteristics I'm going to cover: color, contrast, the quantity or intensity, and the direction of light. I'm going to go over these pretty quickly because I want this to stay in bite-sized pieces. This should all come together as we get to the end of the series. So the color of light. You know that it's very pretty at the beginning of sunrise and for the period of time right before sunset. The sky becomes, if it's not overcast like it is here in Chicagoland today, the sky becomes a little more orangish. And the reason for that is the sun is coming at an angle, it's refracting through the sky, and the way you perceive it, it's got more of a warm tone to it. On the other side, if you go out before sunrise or if you go out after sunset, the sky and everything you look at tends to start losing its color. It gets a little bluish, a little cool. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that if you want people to look good, you really want that sun to be flattering. And so shooting early in the morning, later in the afternoon are going to generally give you better looking photos than shooting during midday or certainly after the light goes down. The quantity of light. Now this relates, as I said, to the exposure of the sensor, but what happens, if you ever go into a brightly lit room after being in a dimly lit one, that light is overwhelming. Everything in your senses is overwhelmed. You may put sunglasses on to cut that down. Camera works in a very similar fashion. If it doesn't have enough light, it will intentionally, because it's guessing, usually underexpose the photo. If it has too much light, then it will overexpose that photo. So what we're trying to find is a balance, and using the aperture of your camera lens, adjusting the ISO down to a lower number, and using the right shutter speed will often counteract the too much or too little light that you find in nature. So the quality of light is also very important. I do an entire course on the importance of light and how to understand and use the fundamentals of light, but let's just say that soft light is going to be more flattering. If you've ever stood out at noon and had the sun coming down on you and you see the shadow coming off your body, it's a very hard shadow. The sun is a really small light source compared to your body because even though it's huge, it's 93 million miles away. The general rule is that the bigger the light relative to the person, that is bigger, softer, closer, will be more flattering. And of course, you want everybody you take pictures of to look good, so soft light is usually the best. The harsh light is very contrasty, shows up the imperfections. Somebody my age doesn't really want to be shot in harsh light very much. It is used in fashion because it helps bring out the detail in clothes, and it's got more of a masculine as opposed to a feminine feel about it. Direction. This is the last thing we're going to talk about today. So the direction of light can change the emotion of your photo. It can also be used to slim somebody down. If you only illuminate half of somebody's face, or if you illuminate the eyes and the nose and leave the rest in shadows, then you really bring the focus of your pictures to the face and ignoring the rest of the body. If you're using sunlight, you can position the person in shadows, you can turn them, and we'll talk about that in the techniques, so that you can use a little bit of the direct light and a little bit of the more shadowy light to create a dramatic photo. It'll make your pictures look better, because if you just stand people out in front of you facing the camera, you're going to get a whole lot of images that look like your driver's license picture, and that's probably not the one that you'd like to have in your portfolio. So anyway, that's the end of part 2. So go back and look at this again. ISO, aperture, shutter speed. Take a look at your camera. Figure out where those are. Read the manuals. There's nothing wrong with reading the manual that came with your camera. And in the next section, we're going to talk about good and bad photos. Thank you very much and have a great day.